Good morning and welcome to Crossroads United Methodist Church. So glad you chose to join us this morning for worship. A couple announcements before we get started. One is if you have not already received your copy, we have these daily devotionals that we are selling for $12. It is a wonderful resource with daily reflections and readings for you this year from our lectionary, which then lead up to what Don and I will be talking about on Sunday mornings as well. So if you have not gotten yours but would like one, please contact the office and we'll gladly mail one out or drop one off to you. Also, with Martin Luther King Day Jr. celebration here on Monday, we wanted to make you aware of a couple opportunities inside the conference to celebrate and reflect on that day. One is that there'll be an online Zoom study of a movie on Sunday evening at 6 o'clock. That's today. If you're interested in that, please go to the church's website, cantonforallpeople.org, or the conference website, eocumc.org, and register for that class. It is being led by Dr. Tasia Beulah Howard of MTSO, and it'll be a really neat experience for you. Also on Monday, there'll be a special celebration up in Cleveland and service as well that you could stream or that you can go up and participate in. So we hope you participate somehow in celebration and memory of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And now, let us turn our hearts and minds and focus our preparation this morning on worship. I wanted to share with you all some really neat things that happened this week here at Crossroads. We were given a grant by the Governor's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives to receive coats just like this one for our community, as well as brand new sneakers, tennis shoes for kids. This week we've had several families come in here who are here to shop in our Fresh Market and Free Store, but also in need of shoes, in need of coats, and we still have some pajamas left over as well. And because of your generosity of supporting these missions and ministries, we were able to help them. And in several instances, the mothers left crying because they were just so overwhelmed at the items that they received and how they were able to provide for their families. So if you've not done so already, I encourage you to either mail a check in here to church or click on our website. There's a way to donate that way as well, so that we can receive and celebrate your financial givings, but also consider how you might give of your time and talent as well this week. So for everything that you do and continue to do, just wanted to say thank you.
Friends, I want to welcome you to our new sermon series and teaching series that begins this Sunday that we're calling I'm Too Old for This, and where we're going to dig into a number of topics, looking at the Bible over the next 6 weeks that are relevant to something that's frankly relevant to all human people. We all get older. And so each week we're going to look at our scriptures and faithfully engage them and look at those topics that are relevant to things about aging. Things like caregiving and taking care of our relatives or even ourselves as we get older. Diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer that we've all had loved ones, grandparents, and friends that have gone through these things. And what does the role of faith play when we get older and we face down these things? Things like parenting adult children coming up in a couple weeks. As one myself, it's a topic that I'm interested in. Or as a grandparent, taking care of the grandkids and the great-grandkids. What's our role as faith stewards in their lives? We'll look at losing folks. As we know we get older, we all tend to join clubs of losing relatives and friends and our parents. And what is the role of faith as Christians that play in aging? And then, of course, finding hope and purpose and meaning, even sometimes when we lose independence as we get older. Because I don't care how old you are, at someone my age, I got a birthday coming up in a couple weeks, and I don't feel old, I don't think that I'm old, but even I feel old sometimes. I recently did a wedding for a very close cousin of mine just last week. Thank you, Pastor Jeff, for a wonderful message and holding down the fort there. But there were a few moments during this wedding where even I felt old. And that in this cousin who was born in 1995, I can't help standing at the front of the aisle, getting ready with him right there and watching his lovely bride and the other cousins and family come down the aisle as men of honor. And I can't help but seeing this guy that I was marrying, not as this 23, 24-year-old man who's now about to start his own family, but as an 8-year-old kid. So you look at him and just go, man, where did the time go? I felt old. Or even worse, being asked to do a wedding of another cousin who was at the wedding, who was even younger than him. And my memories of this one were of the little toddler that Aaron would be cuddled up with him on the couch. And at one point, I think he even peed on her at some point. And we made jokes about that when he asked me to do the wedding. Or even worse, during the reception, when they're going through the litany of dances that everybody does at their family weddings and receptions, and all the ones that I knew, but being the age of this wedding, we got to let's just say, an age of music that I was not familiar with. And at some point, even the millennials, like myself, had to step off the dance floor and say, okay, Gen Z, you got it. Those are dances that you know, makes you feel a little bit old. And I'm going to start this week by stating an obvious fact, and that is there are differences between people of different generations We look at things differently, different life experiences that we experienced collectively as age cohorts affected us in different ways. And where these differences exist, sometimes there can be sources of conflict between generations or people of different ages, especially when they attempt to work together or they're in some kind of organization or some kind of team. The church being another example. A lot of the divides within the church in recent years or decades sometimes have fallen along the fault lines of age, generational age cohorts. And this Sunday is Human Relations Sunday. In our United Methodist Church, it's always the Sunday right before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, where we attempt to focus on those things that we can better do as people and humans to improve relations between one another. And in keeping with our theme this week, we're going to look at relations between generations, and something that we've titled Changing Times and Changing People. Now, I want to bring up, right? So I'm about to list some generalizations. It doesn't always apply to you, but to some degree, people who have collectively lived through certain experiences together and events have a way of collectively forming people in what are called generational cohorts. And we've all heard some of these terms today. And there are about, sociologists would say, 6 generations alive today. And in looking at our church membership records, we have all 6 generations represented here at Crossroads United Methodist Church. The oldest of the generations still among us are those folks you might have heard in the greatest generation. The economic turmoil of the Great Depression profoundly impacted this generation, leaving its members with a desire to end poverty and create economic opportunity for those after it. As a result of this drive, this generation is recognized for their success in later years. And in part, a result of the Great Depression and World War II, this generation developed great resilience in surviving hardship and solving problems. And there are a few characteristics that we'll go through of each of these generations. Mind you, let me repeat again that these are just generalizations, and while these might apply to one generation as what they emphasize, they can certainly be spread across many. But our folks of our greatest generation, things that they tend to value were personal responsibility, because of the harsh realities of the Great Depression, forced so many into a higher standard even as children. They had to take on a lot to get through there, making sure that they could make ends meet to support their families and their loved ones. Folks of our greatest generation tend to uphold a sense of humility, and that the Great Depression fostered modesty and humility in many of those who lived through these events. They were very frugal people, saved every penny and every scrap because they helped their families survive through times of shortage. Use it up, fix it up, make it do, or do without was the motto of their time. They're very committed people, believed in integrity above almost all things, and self-sacrifice. As millions sacrificed to defend their country or support the war effort, even at home, we had ration stamps where people couldn't go get as much gas or bread. Pennies were changed, and so they had to sacrifice a lot in a short amount in their generation for the collective good. Now, their children, folks born between 1926 and 1945, are what we would call the silent generation. This was probably the first defined age cohort or generational group. And these people are folks who lived through World War II. And the name comes from an article in Time magazine from the 1950s that alludes to the fact that the children of this generation were taught to be seen and not heard. According to sociologists, this group is very well disciplined. They are value-oriented and extremely loyal and interested in direct communication. And so they really enjoy speaking in person as opposed to via technology. Now, the generation after this, and a name you've heard a lot, and it used to be our largest generation here, are the baby boomers. And this is the only generation that's been defined by an official government body, in that the U.S. Census Bureau has stated and has set parameters for what the baby boomers are. They're named this because of the huge surge of births after World War II. The group starts in 1946 and ends with those who were born around 1964, when the birth rate began to decline again. Baby boomers tend to be very committed, self-sufficient, and competitive. If you've ever played bridge or euchre with someone from the baby boomer generation, you know what I'm talking about. And it could be, sociologists think, that because there were so many of them, that they just had to compete and having something to do. The generation after that is something called Generation X. And the Resolution Foundation think tank defines Generation X as those born between 1966 and 1980. And they grew up in a time when technology was advancing fast. But it wasn't nearly as readily available as it is today. And because of this, this generation kind of straddles both the digital and the non-digital world and understands the importance of both of these things. These folks tend to be very resourceful, very logical, and are very good problem solvers. Now, the generation you probably hear the most about in the news today, and one of which I am included, would be the Millennial Generation. And this is the cohort you've probably heard the most about. Like I said, it's not entirely certain where the generation starts and ends, but it's approximately born from 1980 to 1995. In the news, they're often described as lazy in the media, and that they spent all the money they should have been saving for their house on things like avocado toast or Pandora Premium. But they also are the first generation to be digital natives. As sociologists describes them, she thinks, and they think, that makes them extremely self-sufficient in that they no longer have to rely on others to solve their problems, to teach them things, and that they have the internet for that. Just look it up on YouTube and figure it out. These folks, Millennial Generation, tend to be very confident people, very curious people, and most importantly, for our topics today, millennials tend to question authority, which has led to a lot of conflict between millennial generations and others who just didn't do that. Most millennials were between the ages of 5 and 20 when the 9/11 terrorist attacks shook the nation. They were old enough to comprehend the historic significance of that moment, while most members of Gen Z have little, the next generation, a memory of that event. And they're shaped by events like the Afghanistan and Iraq wars and the financial collapse of 2008. The generation after them, Gen Z. And there are a few conflicting ideas about where this generation starts. Pew Statistics says 1997, so we'll go with that today. Wherever it begins, though, we can safely say that this group is very young and has never known a life without technology. And then that might be why their alternative name, coined by American psychologist Dr. Jean Twenge, is the I generation. And some of the characteristics include these folks are very ambitious, digital natives, and very confident. And in this progression, what is unique for Generation Z is that all of them above have been, technology has been a part of their lives from the start. The iPhone launched in 2007 when the oldest Gen Zers were 10. And by the time they were teens, the primary means by which young Americans connected with each other was through the web and mobile devices. Wi-Fi and high bandwidth and cellular service was a regular part of their life. Social media, constant connectivity, and on-demand entertainment and communications were innovations that millennials had to adapt to, but Gen Z has had from their very births. Now, the implications of these things, right? People research and debate on whether or not these things are good or whether or not they're harming society as a whole, and we're still in flux there. But folks are beginning to track this new and emerging generation, and even so, to make you feel really old, the generation after Gen Z is something that is starting to be called Generation Alpha. These kids are the kids that are my children's age. Age is about 10 right now and below. And next, these kids are going to be on the scene. Whereas right now, millennials are the biggest generation in our workforce. Someday, it'll be Gen Alpha. And this generation has been dubbed Generation Alpha by a social researcher. And they're very young. And the first would have been born in 2010. And they'll eventually become a large cohort in their own right. Now sociologists, kids that age, who knows what'll come in their life and shape their experiences, but doing some predictions, sociologists believe that these kids are going to end up being very family-oriented, as their parents will be Gen Xers and millennials who were very engaged socially as parents and more digital savvy than any other generation that has come before them. Now, I wanted to bring up in our scripture text today, as we go into, which is going to come from Exodus chapter 1, about some communication breakdowns between generations. Because as I started at the beginning of this message, right? It's Human Relations Sunday, and oftentimes we find that there are fault lines that get drawn behind these generations. And what's difficult in all of this is communicating and working well with one another. And there's a story at the beginning of the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 1, and it reads, "There are the names and the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." This is coming off the heels of the story of Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat before he rises to power in Egypt. And then in verse 8, it goes on to read, "Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase in the event of war, join our enemies, and fight against us, and escape from the land.'" We find out in these verses that it was important for the author of Exodus, before they actually get into the story of Moses, to bring up this fact, before we find out in the Bible that the Israelites had been enslaved. That as time progressive, Joseph, and more importantly, his God-inspired interpretations of Pharaoh's dreams, are going to now become a distant memory, even though he saved a whole country from famine in the previous book. Instead of general feelings of goodwill towards the Israelites and later generations, as the minority in that country, they're eventually going to become the target of the majority's persecution. And the truth is that civilization always loses a part of our collective memory as generations pass. As an example, the last veteran who served in the trenches of World War I was Henry Patch from the British Army, who died on the 25th of July, 2009, aged 111. And you got to ask yourself, what did that generation have that we need today? What did they know? What did they do? What wisdom could they provide our world's problems and our biggest hurts today? Because the truth is, we have communications breakdowns in the same way that subsequent generations passed from Joseph to new generations and a new king who forgot all the deeds of God and Joseph before. We have that going on today. But the truth is, God's intention for how people are to relate with one another between generation to generation is different than what commonly exists, where we draw these fault lines in the sand and we say things like, "Oh, well, young people don't get this," or "young people get upset with old people because, they just don't get with the times." God's dream is something completely different than the divides that exist today. Paul gives some advice to younger folks in 1 Timothy 4:11. He's going to say something like, "There are things that you must insist on, young folks," he says. "Let no one despise your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. Until I arrive," he writes, "give attention to the public reading of Scripture, to exhorting, to teaching. Do not neglect the gift that is in you, which was given to you through the prophecy with the laying hands of the council of elders." Don't get pushed around just because you're young, he's going to tell the young folks. "Let no one despise your youth, or your gifts, which he's going to emphasize was given to you through the prophecy and laying on of hands by the council of elders. As if to say, the gifts of younger folks were recognized by older generations. Those gifts were not just recognized, they were then encouraged to play a part in the community of faith and in these folks' lives. Moreover, younger folks had to be open to the guidance of those older than them to nurture those gifts and see those come to what God's potential could be through them. Mind you, he's going to follow this up in chapter 5 in 1 Timothy by saying to the young folks, do not speak harshly to an older man, but speak to him as a father, to younger men as brothers, to older women as mothers, and to younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Something tells me that the speech from young folks like, okay, boomer, would not have been acceptable speech for Paul or what we as Christians should be aspiring to in the kind of intergenerational relationships we seek to encourage. Now, friends, I've gone into a lot, and you might be asking yourself, why is this so important? Why should we talk about this in the church? And the truth is that I feel like I am in a very unique place of seeing generations pass before me and having to do funerals all the time. And I get to see this thing that I often come home and reflect on with my wife, is that as generations pass and I watch some of our older generations go and pass on to that life with our Maker, I also get to see the things that we lose. The things that I see them do, the things that are lifted up in their funerals and the things that they do, and how do we hold on to some of that? Some of that goodness, that sense of community, that sense of obligation to the greater good. And most importantly, it is my sense that we're not doing a great job these days as Christians of passing on the promise that God made to mend our entire universe onto the next generation. Of God's promise, of God's saving promise to heal our own souls and our own hearts, but that of the entire world. We have had communication breakdowns. Instead of the way that it reads in Psalm 145, I will extol you, my God and my King, and bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. His greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall laud your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. It's interesting that right before we get to this passage about all the subsequent generations in Egypt forgetting Joseph and everything that he did, at the end of Genesis, at the end of the book of Genesis, we get 4 chapters of a dad passing down God's promise to his kids. The kids we read about at the beginning of Exodus chapter 1. The last 4 chapters of the book of Genesis are reserved for Jacob and Joseph to laud the works of God to the next generation. To give you a sense of the scope, the Noah's Ark story really only gets 2 chapters. But you get 4 for such a short time period for Jacob to pass off everything that he's been given from generations dating back to Abraham to his kids. 4 chapters. The promise made before his time and their time that they might not have had a connection to, it had to get passed. It was of utmost importance, even before the biblical authors start telling us the story of Moses and the redemption and the liberation from Egypt. It was of utmost importance. So as a pastor, as I've watched generations go and continue to watch people that I love go, I have wrestled with this fact of what is it that we need to preserve and make sure that it gets passed off from one generation to the next. Jacob's going to pass off a great number of things to his kids. What is it that gets passed down in your own family? If we remember the story of Jacob, we remember the story of Jacob very early on in his life, where he's going to go out into the desert and he sees God in the wilderness and he wrestles with him, and God's going to break his hip so that he's going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And in thinking about that story, as Jacob passes and his estate would have been begun to get divided up between his 12 sons and who got what, and we've all been there in the story when someone has passed in our family and everybody's kind of going through boxes and things of the house, and some people have an emotional attachment to one thing or the other. Maybe you wanted a set of dishes, or maybe you wanted a set of something that meant a great deal to you, that was from a grandmother or your mother or your father or something like that, and it means a great deal to you. I think, in my sanctified imagination, of all the things that the brothers of Jacob, of the sons of Jacob, would have argued about, I think I would have made a hard case to get his staff. Hear me out. Jacob wrestles with God in the wilderness, where God puts a limp in his step for the rest of his life. And in order to walk and realize that this beautiful image of Jacob having to lean on the staff that is needed for him to take daily steps in his life would have been a reminder for me to see that was his trust in God. Maybe it was a family Bible for you. Getting that Bible handed down that had the notes, that had the highlights, that had the weddings, that had the graduation party pamphlets, and everything packed into it until it was full of everything that you said, this was it. This was their life. This wasn't just what they read. This was them putting their trust in God. And this is a reminder to me that that word of God that led them through their life is what I hope to take in mind. The promise of God that is passed from one generation to the next. I would have fought for that staff. How are we, as we age, to handle changing times and changing people? How does the Bible tell us we should do this? One, with humility. Recognizing the fact that younger folks can indeed teach older folks, and that we never stop learning as we age. And something that the older folks can teach younger folks, and younger folks being willing to accept those things and recognize that we don't know it all. Harder for younger folks, I think, to recognize that, but easier for older folks to lend grace and understanding and stay focused on the promise. How do we deal with changing times and changing peoples, as the Bible says, with patience and open communication? And that sociologist says that the key difference between all of these cohorts, all of us as we age, is that we all communicate differently. So oftentimes we speak right past one another. Where the silent generation and baby boomers had to rely on face-to-face relationships and are, as a result, more engaged in their real-life communities, we recognize that today we straddle that age in this digital age, where younger generations have a social media for that and create their communities online and through digital spaces. How many of you can FaceTime with your grandkids? We thank God for that all the time. When we were stationed across seas, we thank God that we had that technology to be able to connect us. I thank God that we have this technology to be able to connect with you in this pandemic today. We learn things. But it is about human connection for the purpose of staying in loving relationship with one another. So we do it with patience and open communication between generations. And lastly, with a focus on the promise. Letting younger generations see and discover what a life of faith means to you, which means telling them about your life of faith and what has gotten you through those collective experiences. I read an article recently in a Christian publication where a pastor was going on and describing how they have now passed into that club that we will all be in someday as the one who has lost now their parents. Older folks who have already passed and have been in that club for a long time have a lot to teach us younger folks about how to enter those periods of loss and grief in our lives. and older folks who continue to struggle that need sometimes those younger folks to give there, to show up, to be with each other in relationships with patience and open communication. Focusing on the promise that was given to us so that no generation, that we continue to laud the works to one another and declare God's mighty acts from one generation to the next. And there are a few ways we want to forge intergenerational relationships this year, right here at Crossroads. And the first of those is this: within your own families. If you're not already, this year, what would have been a great New Year's resolution is to make more of an intentional effort to communicate in ways that each generation needs. If you're younger, that means showing up more in person, less texts, less FaceTime, and physically being there. If you're older, it means asking your grandkids for help and being involved in their lives in the way that they are currently living them. It means on both sides making the effort to communicate in ways that both sides can appreciate. But it's recognizing how we communicate and making the effort. So making an intentional effort in your own family. 2, our Shore neighborhood, just a block here from the church, as you know, here at Crossroads, which we're very involved in building homes and providing fresh food and the rest of it. We have our King Park Kids program, I say, coming up, but the summer will be here before we know it. And if you don't have grandkids or your grandkids have moved away, I want to invite you, challenge you to adopt the grandchildren of the children that live in this neighborhood. There is a big problem downtown with disengaged youth needing older generations to be actively involved in their lives, at the very least praying for them, if not showing up and just planning a few games, saying hello, and being a loving presence in their lives. You know the biggest age demographic of people in downtown Canton? Children between the ages of 3 and 13. It is an opportunity to bridge the gap, to come together and forge meaningful intergenerational relationships right here in our own neighborhood in downtown Canton. So there's that. And the last one is this: we have confirmation coming up here at the church beginning in Lent. I need prayer partners, mentors, people to pass off and write notes and cards and continue to encourage the youth of our church to continue in their lives of faith so that they know that you will be there, know that there have been people that have gone through the kind of experiences that they will then encounter, and know that that future promise that you have leaned on your entire life can be passed off from you to them. So we need you. And friends, for all of those things and more, for improving intergenerational relationships, to make sure that we're talking in open communications with humility and patience and passing down that promise, I ask for your prayers and invite you to keep an open mind, an open spirit as you engage folks of all kinds and all ages in your life. Would you pray with me? Loving God, we thank you for the creation of all people and the wisdom that you have put within our youth and the wisdom and knowledge that is within our folks that are older. Heal the divides between us and lead us towards lives that would draw us closer together so that we can be more like the people that you envision to be. God, let it not be said of us that the promise that was given to us was forgotten from one generation. And that we, as a people of a generation who have seen and heard and felt your promise within us, can faithfully laud your works to the next generation. In your Son's mighty and great name, amen. Friends, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, may you go from this place, this Human Relations Sunday, forging meaningful, more loving, and open relationships with people of all ages, nations, and races. Go in peace, friends, and have a wonderful week, and we'll see you right back here next week.